In this lecture, I want to talk about the business cycle. And this becomes, it's probably a chapter where economists know a bit less than we do the other chapters. But this chapter comes down to the reason why macroeconomists are macroeconomists. Is that when we think of just your general knowledge about what makes an economy, is we think to this idea that economies tend to go in these kind of cycles where things are good and then things end up bad, and then things get good and then things get bad, and back and forth, back and forth. That back and forth being a cycle. And economists for a long time have tried to figure out, well, why is that the case? What is it that pushes an economy into a bad point in time? What is it that can get an economy out of that bad a time and into a good time? If you think about why, macroeconomics as a field started, it goes back to John Maynard Keynes, and Keynes wanted to understand, the Great Depression. Why was it lasting so long? So his work in 1933 was an attempt to try to model what it was that was going on that caused the situation that we're in. And we look at other modern day macroeconomists of some note, like in my opinion, among the preeminent macroeconomists such as Ben Bernanke, let's just stick with Ben Bernanke. Ben Bernanke is, even when he worked on his dissertation, he said, how can you be an economist without understanding the Great Depression? And so his work was focused on that. Oh, we're going to do some Keynesianism here as well, but we just want to understand in general, at a kind of very elementary level, what is it that we're talking about how economies enter these cycles. Okay. So we see these cycles over time. As these cycles are happening, as these fluctuations are happening, we obviously want to talk about how we can get in and out of these time periods. How can we keep the good times going longer? How can we get out of the bad times? And how is it that having a market economy is it creating more stability, or is it making things just as unstable as anything? And what role then did the government have? And that was something that Keynes especially took on as one of his tasks. Okay, so we go back here, right, and we see this, and we go all the way back to the beginning of the 20th century. Again, we see these cycles. And in the 1920s, a lot of research was devoted to understanding business cycles. And all that research did is it made us completely unprepared for the Great Depression. I mean, even to this day, to be honest, there's theories about what made the Great Depression a Great Depression, but there's not a lot of anything definitive that we know about what made the Great Depression such a Great Depression. But what we do know is that business cycles used to be a lot shorter. How do we know this? Let's look at this. So there's a NBR business cycle dating committee. So the National Bureau of Economic Research is the agency, the research organization in charge of declaring when a recession is a recession and that kind of thing. There's something I'm looking for here, though. Give me a second. Sorry, 1 second. I just cannot find what I'm looking for here. Just going back to where I was. So if you go to this site, this is nbr.org/research/data/whatever, and you kind of follow the links I have here. What's cool about this is you can actually, they went back in time as much as the data would tell them, and they go all the way back to the business cycle that started well before the Civil War. And they would see that an economy in this point here had about a year and a half in which it was contracting, almost 2.5 years where it was expanding, and that it was a total of a 4-year business cycle. And you see, especially in the time of the postbellum era after the Civil War, where you get some pretty long-lasting economic cycles. A lot longer contractions than expansion. You obviously want the expansion to be pretty long. But what you see here is that it used to be the case, even through the early World War I time period, where the average cycle is about 3 years from start to finish. And it's only in our lifetime where we have these business cycles that are like 10 years long. It's pretty long. 100-month business cycle. You have an 8-month contraction, which happened in the very beginning of the first time we fought in Iraq during the first Bush administration, and it lasted all the way until the second Bush administration with the dot-com bubble bursting, 92 months later. And then we get a small recession in 2001 that lasts 8 months, and then you have 10 years of expansion, at least, 120 months at least total, that gets us all the way, nearly 10 years, that gets us all the way to the 2008-2009 crisis. That unfortunately lasts a little bit longer. We have a year and a half of contraction here. And then the expansion takes us all the way until COVID. And with COVID, we have an incredibly short recession. That comes on the heels of a pretty long time period after it. Okay. Let's go back to our slides here. So the Great Depression in itself, as the slide points out here, really did give birth to the field of macroeconomics, the course we're in right now, but it also, it came down to the debate. If we think about philosophically what the debates were about, it was, do we have a state? Do we want to have a market economy? Should we go into socialism? How big of a government role should we have? I mean, these were things that were up for debate. Things that we don't necessarily talk about today when we had the great, the recession of 2007 to 2009. We aren't really talking about giving up the market system in the way that they were during the Great Depression. So this business cycle, we have these alternating periods of the economy growing and contracting. And as it's doing it, we need to think about why is it doing this? And what role do we have with the government in trying to get out of the bad time periods quickly and stay in the good time periods much longer. The general belief, at least prior to the 1930s, or at least prior to the Great Depression, was that you didn't really want to have much government involvement. Laissez-faire, leave it alone. French for leave it alone. That the government doesn't really get involved, and that the market and the fact that markets go back to equilibrium pretty darn quickly by sending reasonable price signals, you want the market to just do its work. And it explains why, when the Great Depression started, not under, Franklin Roosevelt doesn't take office until 1933. Before him, we have Herbert Hoover. And Herbert Hoover, gets us these kinds of things where people are just told, be positive, be good to each other. Maybe if you don't have enough food, go to a church or a food, soup line or whatever and get what you got to get. But otherwise, businesses just need to get out of this themselves. Very different from what we talk about today, right? When we have a recession where we talk about government programs to get us out of it, especially during COVID, where we saw a massive government intervention to make that recession as short as it was. things change with the Great Depression, where we get a justification for the government and we start to change our notion of the market being inherently stable. Instead, we start to see it as something that can only be stable with government intervention. So before the Great Depression, we didn't really have Keynes, John Maynard Keynes, and so everything was driven by what we kind of talked about in chapter 3 with the supply and demand model, where in that model, things are just, right, if we let's see if it's going to let me draw here. I just want to draw. Right, where if we just let things work out like this, right, if we get the price wrong, it just always goes back to the equilibrium price right here, despite getting things wrong. Things self-adjust. This is a classical model. And why is it called classical? Because it goes all the way back to Adam Smith, right? And it just goes back to the very notions, the very underpinnings of what it means to have a market-based economy. The market was seen as you have these periods of instability, but the market will go back to having the equilibrium again. Now, what that requires is that the prices and wages be flexible and are allowed to go back to the equilibrium. When we have a recession, we have excess goods, so then they become cheaper, and then people buy them, right? When things are doing too well, then we start to get inflation, prices are way too high, people stop buying things, and it stops the economy from getting too hot. Just like when a recession, the economy is stopped from getting too cool. Go back to equilibrium. Now, the question is how do you get from a point of the late 1920s, especially 1929, where the economy is entering a recession, and that recession turns into a depression, and that you get Franklin Roosevelt entering into the presidency in 1933, and the recession is actually even worse than it was in 1929. If prices and wages are flexible, why are things getting worse? That was what Keynes took on. And so John Maynard Keynes, born on the same day as Adam Smith, on June 5th, and the same day as me, June 5th. That's right, dude. 3 economists, all born on June 5th. I'll just say the collective we. Oh, it's not really. But we're all Geminis, I guess. What Keynes did is he just said, well, what if prices and wages aren't flexible? What if they're sticky? It would make sense because, right, I think of my own employment. I have a labor contract. I'm in a union. And my wage can't be adjusted. I mean, yeah, you could file lawsuits and, they could get the contract, altered and whatnot, but my wage doesn't go down, even during COVID, because it was too much of a pain in the ass to try to even adjust my wage then. During the 2008-2009 crisis, financial crisis, it was bad enough that I did have a furlough then at that point, and they made us take off every other Friday or something to be able to reduce my wage. But it caused a lot of ill will, and no one was happy about it. So it basically means that my wage was kind of temporarily stuck higher than it should have been. And we can think about prices for things that are bought, right? They're usually bought under contracts, under very long-term contracts. And so, people might be stuck for a while at a certain price, and it can't adjust. And the classical theory, again, was based on this idea of Say's law. And so Say's law essentially would say to us that the supply creates its own demand. When things are produced, those people who are producing it get paid, and those people then buy stuff, right? So the supply creates the demand. And if people stop producing stuff, then they stop getting hired, they don't work as much, they don't get paid as much, they don't buy as much, right? So the supply in that case is not enough to create its own demand. But things are self-regulating. Again, based on that idea, again, of an economy that's always going back to equilibrium. Where prices are too high or prices are too low. And now we can think of this Q, that is the quantity of consumption for a particular good, but for the entire economy, that we're trying to get back to this optimal point here. So here we go. That's where we get Keynes. Is that what happens if things don't adjust automatically? Again, what if we have these prices that are stuck in some weird ways? What if we don't get this self-adjustment based on the prices? And what if the problem is that the demand is stuck too low? Right? What if misery causes more misery? Now, Keynes was a little bit, wasn't exactly socialist, but he did favor a lot more government intervention. Out of the belief that a market economy is unstable, but that if you have the government intervene and you have it increasing the demand when it needs to be increased, that a market economy can be made more stable by having government intervention. Now, what that requires, right, and this we do see, and we do follow this to this day, is that when the economy isn't doing well, the government intervenes and it starts to buy more stuff. It hires more people. It provides more money. We certainly saw that during COVID, where during COVID, the federal government alone spent over $2.1 trillion to stimulate the economy. And the only reason it spent that much money was because they realized that during the 2008-2009 crisis, when they only spent $785 billion, a lot less, that they basically didn't do enough and that the recovery took a lot longer. They just plowed money to solve COVID. States did it. I mean, I'm in state public higher ed, right? I mean, I've never had it so good. I'm really honest. I'm being really serious about it. I mean, I've got more computers than I've ever had in my office, more than I need. And I mean, the COVID funds that were supplied, now I keep hearing from my bosses how they're worried that all that money is now gone. And yeah, I mean, it's going to have to cause some some cutbacks at some point. And universities are also getting rid of some people too that they were able to have on because of government intervention. Now, it goes the opposite direction as well. At least it should. That when the economy is doing very well, the government should raise taxes or it should spend less money. And these don't happen that often. And so people like to follow this Keynesian prescription, but they don't usually follow that one. But here you go, right? Here's a business cycle. Reaches a peak in terms of real GDP, then things slow down. Then things get well, then things slow down. Then things do well, then things get slowed down. So we got this peak where the real GDP is maximized, a contraction where the GDP is declining. So that would be our time period right here, our contraction. The trough would be the very bottom, and then the recovery would be our uptake from the trough to the peak. In general, when we look at that growth trend, we want to see an economy generally growing about 2% a year in growth. So it's not going to be that steep, but about 2% a year would be our real GDP growth rate over time. And we can see here that according to this historical average here of 3%, which is a little bit more, but it's getting a little bit closer to 2% here. Again, we can see these deviations from that long-term 3% growth rate. It's getting to be a little bit lower than this 3% though. But yes, again, right, we can see that long-term growth rate that we have these fluctuations from it. I say that because obviously for the past 13 years, 14 years, 15 years, I mean, it's really been since 2005 that we've actually been able to exceed that 3% growth rate. It's quite a long time. The data at least is suggesting that it's less than 3. I mean, think of that. Look at that. 1933, you've got the economy shrinking by over 10% a year on an annual basis. That's just crazy. So when we think of that growth is that the real GDP is growing. Again, I'd say a little bit closer to 2%, but I'm not sure. Let's say 3%. The growth recession would be is that the real GDP is growing, but it's growing slower than the 3%. I don't think an economy growing at 2%, we'd say we're in a recession. It's growing at about the more recent historical rate. Now, when we hear the R word, recession, we're talking about the real GDP declining typically, not assuredly, typically for 2 or more quarters. That is not always the case. The COVID-19 recession wasn't even 1 quarter long. It was 2 months. So we call it a recession, but really wasn't. And that NBER committee that I was referring you to, they don't just look for 2 quarters. They look at a variety of different things that are all changing. In fact, if we go back to here and we look at all the data that they do, right here, they are looking at a significant decline in economic activity across the economy that lasts more than a few months in terms of depth, diffusion, and duration. So it's not just 2 quarters. Here we go. The committee subsequently determined that the trough occurred 2 months after the peak of the, well, here we go. You can read the whole thing here. But after February 2020 peak in economic activity, we concluded that the drop in activity was so great, so widely diffused, that we should have a recession, even though it was so brief. But again, it was only 2 months long. So it's not just 2 quarters. Depression would be an extremely deep recession. And again, we haven't had a depression since, well, almost 100 years ago, right? 90 years ago. Sometime. The 2008-2009 financial crisis was pretty significant, though. I had just recently started my career as an economist at that point, and it was really bad. There's this line you can kind of say sometimes where it's going to sound weird when I say this, but I'm just kind of relating my experience with this is that in 2008, late 2008. I could go outside, and it was, outside of my office, and it just looked like a scary world where markets were crumbling, and we were literally days from an entire collapse of the economy. That's a great recession. That's because it wasn't just falling house prices and stock prices. It was when we call it, we really should call it here a financial crisis, because financial markets in general were failing. The credit markets were frozen, meaning no one could borrow money. And there was nothing to believe that things were going to recover anytime soon. And it was so bad that we had the slowest recovery in US history, as I said. So the solution there was that when we had the COVID recession, that we were going to even put more money into the economy so that the recovery was faster. We did. The problem is that whereas in the 2010s, we didn't have any inflation, what we're seeing right now is inflation caused by the fact that we had so much money put into the economy in 2020. So when we put this all together, what we're seeing when we understand macroeconomics and we have things like external shocks like COVID or wars or things like that that are affecting the macroeconomy, and then we're trying to counteract these shocks sometimes with different policy levers, the government doing different things. Then we get these internal market forces too, where we talk about markets being organized in different ways in terms of competitive forces, bankruptcies, all those sorts of things. But all these things together come together to determine how much is going to be produced. That's our GDP. Where the jobs are, that's our unemployment rate. What the prices are, that's our inflation rate. What the growth rate is of the output, right? And then how things stand in terms of international trade. So we generally see these outcomes, in the data that we looked at in terms of chapters 5, 6, and 7. We learned how to measure this, how to measure this, how to measure this. Now, what this chapter is basically saying is when we see bad numbers here, how do we alter these things so that we get better numbers here? And so there we go here. I'm not going to read what I just said. Or this here. So, okay, so these two slides here are just explaining what I just said. So there's our conflict here. Our conflict is that before the Great Depression, we used Say's law, and we just said that as a classical economist that markets fix themselves and that markets are inherently stable. Keynes' response was that markets left on their own are unstable, and that what we need to do is that we need to use a different policy lever, meaning government intervention, to fix the market when it's not performing well. So how does Keynes do this? He actually builds a model. And he builds a model called aggregate demand and aggregate supply. Now, these are not the same as demand and supply. Not the same as demand and supply. But it looks like demand and supply. So, whatever it takes. If you want to just call it, demand and supply, and know that they're moving in a direction like this because of how it works for just regular demand and supply, that's fine. But know that the curves are not the same. So, for instance, the regular demand curve is downward sloping because as prices get cheaper, people buy more stuff. That is not why the aggregate demand curve is downward sloping. And the same will apply to aggregate supply. So let's talk about these. So the aggregate demand curve here is referring to the total quantity of the output. So on our x-axis is now real GDP. And on the y-axis is the price level, which we could measure with like the GDP deflator or the CPI or whatever your thing is. And if we look at all the customers in the economy, we get this aggregate demand curve, which essentially is equal to consumption plus investment plus government spending plus net exports, all the components of GDP. But now look at what happens. When you change one of these components, like government spending, and you increase that, what it does is it can shift out the aggregate demand curve. That's the Keynesian innovation there. Is that, for instance, if consumption is going down because there's a global pandemic, then we need to offset it with government spending going up in order to shift out the aggregate demand curve that was being pulled in because consumption was going down. Now, in general, we can say that as the price level is going down, people do buy more stuff. There is no law of aggregate demand. Now, we're keeping this somewhat simple too, so if you're really interested in this kind of stuff, then I would suggest that you take intermediate macroeconomics with me. This becomes an important slide then. So, whereas for the demand curve, we just had a law of demand, and we just said prices go down, so people buy more stuff. Now, the reason why the aggregate demand curve is downward sloping is three effects: the real balance effect, the foreign trade effect, and the interest rate effect. So the real balance effect is saying is that as the price level is going down, then the cash you hold is worth more. So you feel richer. You're not actually richer, but you feel richer. So you buy more stuff because you feel richer. The foreign trade effect is saying is that if the price level goes down, in the United States, then people will buy more American goods, right? So that would mean that'd be good. People would be buying more US stuff. And if the price level is going down and it causes lower interest rates, then people will borrow more money. People will borrow more and people will just spend more. All these things happened um, during the kind of COVID recovery. Now, for the aggregate supply curve, same thing, real GDP, price level. And we could have a long run aggregate supply curve that looks like this, but now here's the Keynesian innovation. Is that the short run isn't necessarily the same as the long run. So why would it be completely horizontal in the short run? Well, think back to my example of what I said about my wages as a union employee, right? My wages are stuck by a contract, adjustable. And even I'm in a union, just think about what if I wasn't? I'd still be grumpy if someone wanted to reduce my wage. So wages are stuck and are very rigid in moving in a downward direction, but they can move up pretty easily. And we can see this also with prices about the stuff that surrounds us, right? Sometimes prices can go up pretty easily, but for most goods like gasoline, so they can go up, change quite quickly for things like gasoline, but they don't change as often for other kinds of goods and services. Why is that aggregate supply curve upward sloping? We got two things going on here. The profit effect, where we're talking about how firms adjust their prices to be able to improve their profits, and then the cost effect. What happens, how do they raise their prices when their internal costs are going up? When we put this all together here, and we've got our aggregate demand curve downward sloping for these three reasons. We have our aggregate supply curve upward sloping for these two reasons. We put them together in the Keynesian perspective, and we get this, where the economy is in equilibrium. And as the economy reaches that equilibrium, things are good. How would we understand the business cycle then? We would understand the business cycle as points where we deviate from that equilibrium. In other words, what we could do to add to this graph is we could say that the economy, remember back when we talked about the production possibilities frontier? And we kind of said the economy has kind of like a natural long-term rate of production. Well, what if we found out what that quantity, that GDP level was, where we're on the PPF, and we put it right here? Then we could imagine that, let's say the economy has a pandemic. Look straight, where aggregate demand falls a lot because consumption is lower. Now look at what happens. Now the equilibrium is less than the long run. That would be a recession. So again, what's the point here? Is that you want to have government intervention increasing to push the economy back to the long run. And so again, this is kind of what you see right here. That E is a point where, let's say, we have our full employment, or sorry, here they're really confusing people, dude. So here's their long run curve. And they're just saying that at point E, we're kind of in a recession here. QE is too low, and we have some higher unemployment. Because we're producing less stuff, we have higher unemployment. We need to fix this economy. We don't want the market to just kind of generally go, slowly back to the equilibrium of full run. We want to make this recession short. So we're going to intervene, and we're going to push the economy here by intervening. And you can see as well that we can do things that will shift the aggregate supply curve. We can shift the aggregate supply curve when business costs go up, when taxes go up, when we have a natural disaster. All these things will shift the aggregate supply curve. And it can go in the opposite direction for these bounteous harvests. Wow, what a great use of the word. But again, we can think of economies where curves are shifting and moving us away from the long run equilibrium. Again, government intervention from the Keynesian perspective is what pushes us back to the long run equilibrium. And then again, we can have our reasons why the aggregate demand curve is shifting. Less spending, expectations changing, our taxes changing, and those are all things that can take us away from the long run equilibrium. Again, government intervention can change things and push curves back to the equilibrium. And so when we change these curves, the aggregate demand curve or the aggregate supply curve, then the result is that we get this business cycle where then it becomes important for policy officials to move us out of a recession or to stop the economy from doing too well. Again, most of the time, government's really bad at stopping an economy from overheating. Most of the time, they seem focused on recovery from a recession. They call this, when it's trying to stop an economy from overheating, they call it taking away the punch bowl at the party, right? That people are getting like blasted drunk, and who wants to be the guy that says no more drinking tonight, right? That's kind of the overheating aspect. So when we turn to these sources of short-run instability, we look at an economy for classical economists where that economy is self-regulating and it will just naturally go back to full employment. The problem for Keynes is either it could work, but it takes a really long time, or if you're a really diehard Keynes believer, it's never going to happen because prices are just so sticky in some directions that we'll be stuck with a less than full employment. Now, this is absolutely true, this last bullet point. We don't even really know what the shapes of these curves are and how much they can shift with changes, even up to this day. And this is now 90 years since Keynes wrote his work. We're still debating and talking about the shape of these curves, exactly what their shape is and their elasticity and how much what we do actually changes the curves. We still talk about it. Keynesian theory is largely a demand side story. So it's largely discussions about how we're shifting the aggregate demand curve. And that when we have that recession, that the aggregate demand curve is too far to the left. Here to the left of the long run equilibrium. And that what we need to do is we need to shift AD curve back to the right by increasing G. Over here, so we would call this, to be precise here, we would call this a recessionary gap. Over here, we have a situation where the economy is actually performing beyond the capabilities of the economy. And now the problem is that we have too high of prices. We have an inflationary gap. And what we got to try to do is cool the economy down by lowering government spending. Again, not often done, because you just look bad trying to slow the economy down. And what you get then, especially then with Friedman in the 1950s and monetarism, monetary theory is also then this demand side theory that kind of counters and builds upon Keynesianism, where it talks about the level of the money supply, and that the money supply can also play a role in what the aggregate demand curve is at, and that there are some, including myself, who believe that there was too much money in the economic system after COVID, that interest rates were too low, that this would be what we call easy money, and that the aggregate demand curve shifted too far to the right because there was so much money supply out there. And that in this past year, we've been trying to tighten the money supply, reduce the money supply to try to shift the aggregate demand curve in the opposite direction, trying to shift it back. It's not been going well, though. We've lived with easy money practically since the 2008 financial crisis, and so money has been cheap for an incredibly long period of time. And now people are realizing they can't borrow money as cheaply as they used to. And so that's what we see here. One where there's not enough demand, and we need to try to push the economy out to the full run equilibrium, and you do that by increasing the money supply. Here you've got too much money supply, you need to curtail it. So that's how we've been trying to control inflation. And we build upon this then, besides the Keynesianism and the monetarism as theories, we can also look at some of the supply side theories, and we can talk about how we can devise some different policies to shift the aggregate supply curve. These come down to how can the government have a role in adjusting the output levels and the employment levels. These are a little bit tougher to do. I mean, we tried some of these even during the Great Depression, in terms of like directly hiring people and whatnot, but these things get to be very difficult. It's much more difficult to manage the supply side of the economy than the demand side of the economy. But you see this here. It's the same logic. It's just a different curve. In this case here, you're trying to shift the aggregate supply curve to the right to get us to full equilibrium, the full output production level. And when we bring this all together, we have to think about what's important for us. And for the most part, what's important to us is not the short run deviations in being a business cycle theorist. What we're trying to do is look at the long run. Again, it's why I'm somewhat arguing that we're not really at a 3% growth rate over the long run, that we need to do a bit more research and talk about the way in which we've deviated on a long-term basis from that growth rate. But again, I might be in the minority on talking about that. But it also leads us then to a long-run output level for the economy. So here's our long-run aggregate supply curve being completely vertical at that long-run point. And again, we can have the deviations from that in the interim, such as we do here, let's say like during COVID, and then we have to do something to push the economy rather than letting us naturally go from B to C, which takes a long period of time. Let's just push the economy by stimulating the economy and going from B to A quickly. But, and this is important, but there is a trade-off. B to C takes a long period of time, but we're left with lower prices. By stimulating the economy as much as we did, for instance, after COVID, we ended up fixing the economy rather quickly and that recession being rather short, but we're at permanently higher prices. A is higher than C, obviously, in terms of price level. That's the trade-off. And it's not one that's typically thought about when people think about Keynes, but Keynes did think it was important as well. And so that's the balance that we then have to live in. Are we going to fix a problem quickly but suffer under prices that are somewhat higher? Or are we going to let the economy fix itself? It's actually what's happening right now in China. China is actually taking the philosophy of let's not stimulate the economy, let's let the economy fix itself. And the result is that their economy is slowing down quite a bit. And it's going to take some time. Fortunately, Chairman Xi doesn't have to get reelected, right? So he can take his time to let the economy fix itself. Whereas Biden, right, wants to get reelected, and Trump wants to get elected. Okay, and so those are decisions for tomorrow, which you can read on your own.